Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Next Man Up podcast. I'm your host, Bannon Crowley. I'm here with my co-host, Colin Martin.
How's it going?
Pretty good today. We took a break last week after the NBA Finals. It was the first time that we haven't recorded since we started the podcast. So we thought, especially with the NBA kind of wrapping up, the NFL going into free agency also, that we'd take a week off. And I pretty much already talked about everything I need to say about the Nuggets. If you haven't watched our video yet on titled How the Nuggets Became Champions, I'd recommend watching that. It'll pop up in one of these corners right now. But for now, we'll talk about some news in the NFL and the NBA, mostly free agency news and some rumors that we have going on. So since we talked about the NBA so much recently, we'll start off with the NFL. With the number one free agent, it seems like right now, DeAndre Hopkins. He's been linked to a few different teams. Obviously, the Patriots and the Titans, probably the top two right now. He went on a visit with the Patriots, but the Titans also seem like they're about to give him a little more money than the Patriots. So interesting back and forth that we'll see. As the DeAndre Hopkins expert, where do you think he's going to go?
Yeah, and if you guys don't know, I'm a big fan of DeAndre Hopkins. He's one of my favorite players in the league. I think it's a two-team race, but I think it's between the Bills and the Titans. As a Patriots fan, I don't want to get my hopes up. The fact I know Matthew Judon has been pointing a lot to getting D-Hop in the building, but as we've talked about off air before, you can't let D-Hop leave. He left New England without signing the contract, and that makes things dangerous because the Titans are going to give him a lot of money. I mean, they're by far the most desperate team to get him. And considering they need him the most, they're going to give him a bag. I think the Bills are a contender too. I know he doesn't have a ton of ties with the Bills right now, but I think he would be the best fit. And we remember just a couple weeks ago when he was given his checklist of the things he wanted. He wanted a QB that loves the game. He wanted a team that could compete, yada, yada, yada. That is the Bills. And we can talk about the Bills later if they're really a competitor or not. But on paper, you have to think that that team could be really great, especially if they get Hopkins. You know, they move Gabe Davis to the slot in this scenario, and they have the most dangerous receiving core in the NFL. I really don't think D-Hop has fallen off. I think he is a top-tier free agent. I don't think we're talking about Odell here that's out of his prime. I think D-Hop is still at the later years of his prime. So I think either of those teams go out and get him. If you have any say about the Patriots, I would love to hear a non-Patriots fan say nice things, but I think the Patriots had to sign him during that meeting period. I don't know about if they're going to get him right now.
Yeah, I mean, the Patriots as of right now are still the heavy favorites that we've seen on all the books. It goes Patriots, Bills, and Lions are the top three right now. The Titans are kind of there around five, they're more towards the Kansas City Chiefs area, who would still be a team that could definitely sign him. But I don't know, a lot of things point to the Patriots signing him. It just depends on if he wants to take less money from them, because he can definitely get more money from another team. He said he wants a quarterback that loves the game or whatever he said about quarterbacks. So I don't know why he would want to go to New England personally. But I mean, it would make sense if he went to Buffalo just because they have a perennial MVP candidate. They probably won't make the Super Bowl with him. They weren't going to anyway without him, because it seems like Josh Allen can't get over the hump anyway. But it would also be an interesting dynamic with Stephon Diggs, who has been very vocal recently and almost sat out this season, but now he's back in practice. So that'll be interesting too, especially since Stephon Diggs has always talked about not getting the ball, and it's always been an issue when he doesn't get the ball. So especially with DeAndre Hopkins there, that might be interesting too. Depends on how long they sign him too as a free agent. I mean, you said he's in the later half of his prime years. I still think he's good, but he's not getting any younger. I mean, he's 31 years old to this point, so he's still got some good years left in him. But if you're a team, you don't want to sign him for like this 4 or 5 year mega contract, because you don't really know how much longer he's going to be able to play at a really high level. So I mean, the Patriots would be an interesting team for him to go to. I think he would probably get the ball 95% of the time. But if he wants to kind of split touches and go to Buffalo, that wouldn't be a bad deal too. The Lions too at 3 is also interesting. I mean, they're a very young team, going to team up with Amon-Ra St. Brown. And well, I guess they're losing some receivers too, because half of the wide receiver team got cut after betting on their games. So I guess they have some money to play around with too. But all these teams would be interesting for him to go to. I don't think we'll see anything soon. I think, like he said, he's going to wait it out a little bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if we still wait another month and he's not signed.
Yeah, and to kick it over to another guy that is a free agent right now, one of the other biggest names. Let's talk about Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook got cut by the Vikings, so they're deciding to roll with Alexander Madison as their lead back. And there's been a lot of buzz. I don't think there's a clear cut favorite where he's going to go. There's a couple teams that we're talking about more than others, but where are some places you could see him end up?
Yeah, I think the one that pretty much everyone's been talking about the whole time, the Dolphins. I definitely could see that one happening. Also the Jets. I would say those are probably the top two favorites right now. I'm guessing odds wise too, they're probably the most favorite just because both of those teams, even though the Dolphins and the Jets kind of both have solid running back cores, if you put him in there, that make it even better. Especially on the Jets too, kind of take a little bit off of Aaron Rodgers. I know there's going to be high expectations, but we don't really know how well he's going to perform there. Also, the Bears, too. I've seen a little bit of buzz for that. They already have a pretty decent running back at this point at quarterback. So I don't know what they would do with that, but I guess they could bolster up the run game, too. The Cowboys, too, interesting. Tony Pollard might not play this season at all, depending on what happens with his tag. So, I mean, the running back market, as we've seen, especially with guys like Saquon Barkley, also Tony Pollard that I just mentioned, Josh Jacobs, all playing on the tag this year. If they do play, they might all sit out. We don't really know up to this point. But I mean, running backs, having Dalvin Cook, who I think is a top 5 running back in the NFL right now, at least top 10. He just getting cut is kind of interesting to look at just because teams don't want to pay him. But we've also heard rumors that he wants to play with DeAndre Hopkins. And I don't really see any of the teams that really line up for both of them to go to because I don't think DeAndre Hopkins would go to the Jets or the Dolphins. I feel like that's Dalvin Cook's probably top 2 options. And then for Hopkins going to the Titans or the Bills or the Patriots, I don't really see either of those lining up. But it would be an interesting thing to see. I think the only way they would team up is probably in Miami, just realistic. I don't really see either of them going to the same team overall, but Dalvin Cook, still a great running back. So whoever gets him will definitely help their run game overall. If I had to make a bet, I would probably say the Dolphins would end up getting him.
Yeah. And you mentioned them, but I thought this was interesting. I had the Dolphins as my number one team as well, but I think the Cowboys would be fun. Even if Tony Pollard does play, we saw the success that Dallas has had in their run game, in the prime years of Zeke and Tony Pollard. Why not get that 2 running back set thing back with Dalvin Cook and Tony Pollard? I don't know how Pollard would feel about that. I think he may be excited to go in as the lead back this year, but you can't deny on paper getting those 2 in your backfield at the same time would be pretty electric. So I think that would be fun. And if he was going to team up with D Hop, I do think the Bills are a good option. I know the Bills don't have a ton of money on them, but if they're willing not to take huge contracts, teaming up Dalvin Cook with his brother James and getting D Hop as an option in Buffalo, I mean, that would be as close to a super team that Buffalo could build this year. So there's definitely something in the water there that could happen.
Yeah. I mean, even with Josh Allen at quarterback, I don't know if I really trust the Bills, but I guess if they do as much as they can, and I mean, Josh Allen will be on the Madden cover this year. He's already been cursed the past few years, so it can't really get any worse to this point. I think it would be great if they did kind of make that offense as good as they can just to give them a legitimate shot, even though this team has been great for years. But I guess we can talk about a few teams who haven't made the playoffs. We both came up with 3 teams who didn't make the playoffs last year, who could potentially make the playoffs this year. Just any teams really. There's obviously every year we get some teams that kind of have injuries. So if you want to start off with your teams.
Yeah. Yeah. And off the rip, I think a team that I'm guessing you'll have on your list as well. I have the Detroit Lions. I mean, after bringing in a ton of talent for the last couple of years and having the rest of the NFC North get progressively worse through these last couple of seasons, I think it's the Lions' time to shine. This is the first time in a long time where we've been predicting them to win the NFC North. I think Aaron Rodgers kind of had a chokehold on that for a long time, and the Vikings have been pretty solid the last couple of years. But I think it's the Lions to lose. I mean, they just have the most talented squad. I love Dan Campbell and what he's built up on that defense. And if they can get a guy like DeAndre Hopkins to, take over some of their wide receiver problems that they've had recently, I think it's a surefire thing. I know they have a lot of pressure on them. They're getting a lot of random coverage from the media, getting gassed up a little bit, but I really do think they're talented enough to win. Next up, we'll talk about the Patriots. I mean, I don't think the Patriots are going to be the most successful team this year. I'm pessimistic as a fan, but not gonna lie, bringing in Bill O'Brien might be really good for the offense. I know he's not an offensive mastermind or anything, but what he does do is play aggressive. And I will say, all my problems with Mac Jones, I haven't seen him play an aggressive style of football in the passing game for a long time. So I think that could be fun. Maybe he'll excel in that offense. And if he does, I mean, that might be enough to excel into a playoff spot. To get a wild card spot, all you really need is like 9 wins. The Patriots had 8 last year, and I would say they're probably a better squad this year. So it could happen. And then lastly, this is definitely the most crazy one I have, but I really do think the Carolina Panthers can make a push. I know this could age very poorly depending on what we see from Bryce Young, but when I look at this team, it's filled out with a great defense. I think they'll have some juice with a rookie QB. And if Bryce Young really is that superstar, perennial Pro Bowler that we think he might be, maybe he gets it done his rookie year. They're playing in the NFC South. I don't see a lot of talent down there that's going to compete with them. So I know that team could be really bad. That team could be the worst team in the league, but I also think they have some, they have some faith over there. They have some ridiculous juice. I mean, who knows? They go out there, they win 9 games, they could win their division.
Yeah. I honestly would say I would probably, if I was a betting man, I would probably bet the Panthers to make the playoffs before the Patriots, just because that means that you would have 4 teams from the AFC East making the playoffs essentially.
You can, I mean, but you can't guarantee that those other teams, the AFC East, are going to make the playoffs, especially Miami right now. If Tyreek Hill, with his legal trouble, is out for an extended part of the season, and Tua is fighting through injuries again, I know the Dolphins are really good. They are probably better than the Patriots, but there's no guarantee that team makes the playoffs. The Jets, I mean, we saw the Broncos last year struggle with Russell Wilson as a new quarterback. I also think the Jets are a better team than the Broncos were last year, but it's not a guarantee that any team in the AFC East is going to be great. I don't, we bank on that a lot, but it's not, I don't think we'll see all 4 AFC East teams live up to their potential this year. I think that's just how the season usually goes.
I will say I do think we will see one team be great in that division with the Bills this year. I think, well, with my first team that I think could make the playoffs this year is the Jets. I don't see them with Aaron Rodgers not making the playoffs. I mean, they've been building this up for a few years, and especially last year having the rookie of the year, I think they could definitely make a push for the playoffs. Another team that you mentioned, the Lions too. I remember we did our predictions last season going into on the old nosebleeds. I don't know if that episode ever got posted, but we have it somewhere. The Lions were, I mean, 1 game away, the last game of the season, from making the playoffs. I said them and the Giants would make the playoffs, and I was laughed at on the air, but I was pretty close to having both of the predictions. And I think the Lions will come back this year, especially with the Packers not having a quarterback. Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask Jordan Love, he's the best quarterback in the NFL, but I think they're a really good team overall, and I wouldn't be surprised if they won the division this year, especially with how shaky Minnesota is. I mean, they were great in the regular season last year, just to lose in the first round, which was good to see as a Giants fan. And I mean, going into that game, even looking aside, there was a lot of people that predicted the Giants to win just because the Vikings team was so shaky. So we don't really know what we're going to get from a lot of those teams. And then another team who I think, I guess this is kind of a combination one. I'm not really sure between these two, but with everything that's going on in the AFC North, I think either the Browns or the Steelers, I wouldn't be surprised if one of them made it in. I mean, the Browns are a really solid team, and I think with a full offseason of Deshaun Watson, I still think he's an elite quarterback. I definitely at least top 10 quarterback for me. And I think if he gets a full offseason there too, the Steelers too, very young. I think they might be maybe a year away, but they're also a team that always figures it out. I mean, they have a coach that refuses to have a losing season. And with that team, I mean, Kenny Pickett is still developing as a quarterback. I don't know how much I believe in him now, but they have a lot of exciting playmakers on that team. So I think they might be maybe a year away. But that division's always competitive. The Bengals are obviously the best team in that division. I think the Ravens are really close behind them, but the Bengals have kind of proven a little more recently. But I do think, I mean, every single year it's very competitive in that division. So I wouldn't be surprised if either one of those teams made the playoffs. I would probably bet more on the Browns this year, but I think in a few years, if Kenny Pickett can continue to develop and they keep putting playmakers on that team through the draft like they have recently, I wouldn't be surprised if they get back to the playoffs.
Yeah, and I respect that. But to kick it over, we just talked about 3 teams each that we think could make the playoffs after missing out last year. Let's talk about three teams that have the most urgency to win this season. This can be interpreted a couple different ways, but I mean, just get straight into your list. Who do you think has the most urgency to win this season?
I think the number one team is the Bills because they've been at the top. They've been expected to win a Super Bowl the past 5 years, and they've been on the doorstep every single year. They just can't beat the Chiefs, it seems like, no matter what. So I think they're number one. They probably, if there's a scale, they're at the very top right now. And then another team too in the NFC, I think they have a little less pressure, but the Eagles were just in the Super Bowl coming off of a great year, and they're kind of starting to build up the momentum to be a team. So we'll either see if they end up being like the Chiefs, who had a very good young quarterback, and then they kind of lost in the first year, and then they came back and won after that, or if they'll go down the Bills path where they just get really close every single time. But the Eagles, I think, are number two at this point. Number three, there's a few different teams that I would go with. I would say kind of teams in the running that I would have is the Jets, obviously, with Aaron Rodgers. The 49ers, too. They've been on the doorstep recently. They don't really know what's going on at quarterback right now. But, I mean, the rest of the team, you could pretty much throw any quarterback on that team, and that offense and defense has carried them. And they haven't been able to get a Super Bowl recently. So pretty much either one of those teams, too. I would say kind of a toss-up between those two, maybe more towards the Jets just because they're kind of going all in right now to win. So I think the Jets definitely have some pressure to at least, I mean, not win the Super Bowl, but they definitely have to make it pretty far with signing Aaron Rodgers and building up this team.
Yeah, and I think we had a lot of similar picks. My number one was easily the Bills as well. They've had a lot of winning in the last couple of years, but they can't get it done in the playoffs. Josh Allen needs to cement his legacy at some point. Is he going to be a Hall of Famer or just a Hall of really good type of player? He needs to make that next push to be considered one of the greats, in my opinion. And he's just not there yet. So if they can get it done this year, it's going to be a whole different narrative. Another NFC East team I had is the Cowboys. And we say this every year because Cowboys fans always hype themselves up as Super Bowl champions before the season starts. But this year, there's a little more pressure because this could be Dak Prescott's last year. This could be Mike McCarthy's last year. And the Cowboys don't win, it might be a slippery slope. This might be a team that has to rebuild because I don't think they're going to hold on to those two if they've proven they can't win anything in the last couple of years. I know that sounds like maybe a hot take, but Dak is going to be wanting big money. And are the Cowboys willing to give it to him if they know they can't win with him? I'm not really sure. I think the Jets are a great pick in the last one, but I want to talk about the Ravens a little bit. Whether they wanted this to happen or not, they just paid Lamar Jackson a huge contract, and they haven't done a whole lot of winning in the playoffs either. They kind of get knocked out early every year when they make it. So if they come up with another competitive season that just falls short again, I mean, you just paid Lamar Jackson all that money for what? I understand, I'm a big fan of his. You got to pay him. I think he's underrated by some, but if you're not winning with him, then does it really even matter? So I think the Ravens are going to be an interesting team. And as you mentioned, in a very competitive AFC North, it's not going to be an easy path to get there. So I think they have a lot ahead of them.
Yeah, and we also haven't seen Lamar Jackson play in the playoffs since 2020. He's been injured every single year too. So we'll see what happens if he can come back and be healthy in the playoffs, especially coming back off of that huge contract that they gave him. But the Ravens definitely a team to look out for coming into this season too. I think they do have a lot of pressure, especially with that contract. And also, I mean, they're built to be competing with the Bengals. They're both very good teams overall. And the Ravens almost knocked them off in the first round of the playoffs last year with their backup quarterback, who I guess was a Pro Bowler. So you can't really say much about that. But Tyler Huntley, the best Pro Bowl selection we've seen since Mac Jones in his rookie year.
Hey, man, I love the Pro Bowl.
Speaking of free agents and trades, we'll bounce over to the NBA. The number one story right now in the NBA is Bradley Beal, who got dealt to the Suns for essentially Chris Paul, a bunch of picks, and I think it was it Landry Shamet that was also in the trade, even though Chris Paul was basically cut from the team a month ago, but now they decided to trade him for Bradley Beal. So good trade for the Suns, bad trade for the Suns. What's kind of your initial reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think like most people, my initial reaction was that the Suns fleeced them. You didn't even give up a first round pick. You gave up a guy you didn't even want on the team, and then you gave up Landry Shamet. Like, who cares? But when I look at it, I have mixed feelings, and I guess I'll get into them a little deeper. I understand you built like another super team with KD, another one that might not work out. But what I really do like is that Bradley Beal is, yeah, he's a star, but he's not a superstar. You know, he could be a role player. And I think that's actually going to work out better for the Suns. If you have KD and Booker as your stars, or, you know, like your best players on the team, and you let Bradley Beal cement himself as just a really good third guy, I think that could be really good for them. My problem with that is that Bradley Beal is making top 20 NBA money. So if you're going to pay that much just to have a glorified Tobias Harris on your team, like, what are you doing? So I have mixed feelings. I know Bradley Beal is really good. I'm excited to see him play with some superstar talent. You know, we've never really got to see that in his career, except when he was really young with John Wall, or like that awkward period with Russell Westbrook. So I think it'll be a fun team, but does this make the Suns like my finals favorite? Not even close. And that's mostly just because of the rest of the role players. I mean, we'll see what happens with DeAndre Ayton. If they can get a bunch of good pieces from a trade for him, then maybe we're talking a different story. But this isn't a team that has a bench, and they just fired like one of the best coaches in the NBA for basically no reason, in my opinion. So it's a very weird scenario. I don't love the Suns team, but I get that they wanted to make a push. KD loves to get 2 stars with him. It's his new favorite thing. So I don't know. I actually want to hear your opinions about it more because I don't have it well threshed out.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to talk about too, you said Bradley Beal getting paid top 20 money. He's getting paid top 4 money, and he's going to be the highest paid player in the league. At within the next few years, he's going to be getting paid $57 million when he's 33. He's only 1 year into that 5-year contract that we've seen. So they're going to be holding on to that money, Kevin Durant's money, Devin Booker's money at this point. And I'm assuming they're going to move on from DeAndre Ayton, who would be making a lot of money soon recently. But I mean, that team is basically like the Nets that we saw from a few years ago. You have your top heavy talent. And I mean, I would say when he was on the Nets, they had a better 3-player combination than they do now. I think Bradley Beal's a good player. He's an all-star player, but he's not James Harden or Kyrie at that point. Devin Booker, I do think, is kind of a fringe top 10 player. But I mean, when he had Kyrie and James Harden, both of those guys were still arguably, I mean, maybe not their prime, but at Kyrie, I probably would say his prime. James Harden may be a little bit off, but what you're going to get from Bradley Beal is a lot of points. But if he's the third scoring option on this team, I don't really know what you're going to get from him, because his whole entire career in Washington was him putting up 30 points a night because he was the only one that knew how to shoot on the team. And he was playing 38 minutes a game, putting up, I mean, last season, he only put up 23 points after they tried to make their big 3 or whatever they tried to do with their kind of mid-level players with Kyle Kuzma, Bradley Beal, and Porzingis. But when we saw 2 guys step in there with him who aren't even that great overall, his points per game dropped by almost 10 points. So now we're going to see him taking a backseat to Kevin Durant, who is the greatest scorer that we've seen in the game, and Devin Booker, who we've seen can absolutely torch when he needs to, especially from mid-range. So what happens with Bradley Beal? Because if both of those guys are great in the mid-range, I mean, Bradley Beal he's a good 3-point shooter. He's not like an elite guy. So if he's taking a lot of 3s per game, which we haven't really seen in his career, I mean, he's a 37% 3-point shooter, which is good, but the top end of his career, he was shooting 8 threes a game on the Wizards when no one else could shoot. So I don't know what we'll see from him, but I don't think he's going to be back to that 30 points per game area. And I don't really trust Bradley Beal overall. I think the Suns, this wouldn't put them as the favorites for me because they don't have a bench at all.
Yeah, no, but what what I will say is that I think you said all the right things, but I think you, as well as a lot of people in the media, are going to compare this team to that 2021 Nets team. This team is worse than that 2021 Nets team, because that 2021 Nets squad, they had Joe Harris, who was a pretty good role player at that time. They had Bruce Brown, who's a role player we both love. They had guys off their bench that would contribute. The Suns don't have that right now. They don't. And I understand they have DeAndre Ayton, who is a little bit more, say what you will about him, but he's a better player than any, other player that Nets team had. But they don't have a bench. They don't have anyone to fill out the squad. Who is the best possible player the Suns could bring in right now? Josh Okogie, because they can afford him. You know what I'm saying? You got to fill out this team in some way or another. And if the DeAndre Ayton trade is the way you do that, that's cool. But they don't actually have a backup center that they can play yet. And the only dude they could afford if they don't get one in the trade would be Jock Landale. These aren't guys that should really be starting on a squad that we think is going to win the chip or anything. What I will say, though, is to talk about Washington. I think it's good for them to move on from the contract. It's been time to rebuild, but I mean, if you're them, don't you wish you just did this last year and got like at least a first round pick? You got something out of it. I think Washington was put into a weird position where there's been so much buzz about Bradley Beal leaving for so long that they felt like they had to do something. And it just, with Bradley Beal's no trade clause and he gets to decide where he goes and decide what the trade looks like, they were kind of just screwed from the beginning. So I don't know. I think it's good for the Wizards to be able to move on to the next step of the franchise. Hopefully at pick 8, they get a stud. They get another guard that could be that guy, Anthony Black, Kason Wallace, someone like that. But as of right now, the Wizards have played themselves into a hole that at least they can try to dig out of. But if this doesn't work out for the Suns, they're just going to have, KD will leave at some point. Booker will get a huge contract. And then you got to pay Booker and old Bradley Beal on a team that's not great. Is that like worst case scenario for Phoenix if things go wrong? I don't know. It's a bad spot. And I like KD a lot, so I don't want to get on here and spread this narrative about him, but he kind of has a thing for going to a team, leaving, and then the team's just in shambles. And are we going to see that again? It's what I worry about as a fan, I guess.
Yeah, and we're not talking about LeBron leaving the Cavs and them being in shambles because they had no one else. We're not talking about like if Steph Curry left the Warriors and they lost their best player. We're talking about Kevin Durant going and recruiting players to go to that team. And then when he leaves, the whole team's down. But to be fair, I'll give something to Kevin Durant. I mean, looking at that Nets team, after he left, I mean, James Harden left too. James Harden left in OKC first. So it seems like all the players he's kind of surrounding himself with, especially if it's James Harden will leave first. And then he's kind of left in this kind of limbo section. But I agree with NBA Twitter, which is usually rare, but I'd rather have Jock Landale than DeAndre Ayton at this point from what we saw in the playoffs. DeAndre Ayton, I don't think is a very good player. I think the problem with him is that if he got drafted not with the first overall pick, the Suns wouldn't be that worried about it. If he was like 10 through 15, if he was outside of the lottery, and he's playing at 18 and 10 a game, that's pretty good. But since he got drafted number 1 overall, there's these high expectations for him. And that's what they set. I mean, in that draft at the time, they believed that he was the best player and they took him. And we've definitely seen that he's not the best player from that draft. But I do think they'll be able to move on from him. And a team that kind of has been in that area of looking for a guy like that is the Celtics. Another guy that's been linked to them is Christian Wood. So I guess my question, would you rather have DeAndre Ayton at this point, or would you rather try to get a Christian Wood package?
Are we talking about for the Celtics or just in
Yeah.
general? For the Celtics, I'd rather have neither. I'm not a fan of either trade. And I actually like DeAndre, and I think we're on different pages. I think 18 and 10 for a center as a role player, which he's become. I know you drafted him early, but he's really always been a role player. 18 and 10 is pretty good. I like that. The problem is the money. That's the same thing for Christian Wood. The only man, I don't want either of them. If I had to pick, I guess I would pick DeAndre Ayton because I really still feel like he has a higher ceiling. But if I'm the Celtics, like, what do you gain from getting a guy like that? I move Robert Williams to the bench, but in a trade, it would at least have to include Malcolm Brogdon or Derek White, guys that were super big contributors on the Celtics playoff run. So it would be a little weird to bring in an underdeveloped center or Christian Wood, who, when he was brought into Dallas, was meant to ride the bench. Or, they brought him in as a 6-man for JaVale McGee. Is that the type of guy I want being the Celtics starting center? Not really. Excuse me, I'm getting like all frustrated, but like I don't know. I wouldn't like either. I think Christian Wood he's always been a bit of an underrated player, but at the end of the day, he doesn't have a high ceiling. The best thing he could do for you is score a lot of points, but if he's a role player, you don't even really need him to do all that. He doesn't have a great defensive game. I don't care what people will say. He doesn't play great defense, and neither does DeAndre Ayton. I mean, I would be pretty frustrated either way. I don't think the Celtics should move on from their best bench pieces because that's the only reason they even stuck in it in the playoffs once Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown were having bad games. It was those bench players that stepped up. So moving on from one of those to pay DeAndre Ayton $1 million and, lose out on any bench depth you had, I think would really screw the team's development. But I think DeAndre Ayton's a little bit better than you're giving him credit for. I will say that.
I think, I mean, if I was a Celtics fan and I could trade Grant Williams for Christian Wood, I personally would. But I mean, I don't know if that's just me, but
No, I mean, Christian Wood's much better than Grant Williams, but you're tied up to a lot more money with Christian Wood. And what does he provide? He's obviously better than Grant Williams, but would Dallas even accept a trade that looks like that? Would anybody even accept a trade that
well,
looks like that?
that's what the rumor is right now. They're trying to do a sign and trade for Grant Williams for Christian Wood. And I think if they could pull that off, that would be a robbery because I don't think Grant Williams is very good at basketball. But I think, I mean, obviously he's getting paid a lot of money, but I think if he went there, they would probably restructure the contract. And obviously Christian Wood wouldn't get more money. I think he would kind of his contract when he goes into free agency again, he would get less money coming into this time because there was a moment in the NBA where a lot of people thought that Christian Wood was kind of next up and he proved it for a minute. And then he kind of just completely fell off. But he's not bad now, but he kind of fell off the expectations that he had overall. But I guess there's some chatter around, especially the Celtics, just because we've talked about it the past few years. That big man rotation, Robert Williams is good and he has a lot of potential, but it seems like he's injured every single game. There's always something going on. He breaks his hand every single game, it pretty much seems like at this point. But I mean, there's a lot of different options too. Some other free agents we can talk about, not exactly linked to the Celtics overall, but a guy like Draymond Green who could stay with the Warriors. I think both of us probably have the same number one team that he would want to try to go to in the Lakers. I don't think that's a secret to anyone at this point. I wouldn't be surprised if Draymond went there, but it'd be really weird to see him leave the Celtics or leave the Warriors.
Yeah, and I kind of still think he'll go back to the Warriors. I mean, the Warriors are what made him the guy he is. If it weren't for, a coach like Steve Kerr and a system like Golden State, he wouldn't be a type of guy that's going to be a Hall of Famer one day. So I think because of that, he would want to go back, but we all know he loves LeBron. He would love to play with him. And based on the fit, if he's willing to come off the bench for that team, him and some of the young guys, because they have a lot of young guys that shoot the ball really well off the bench. So him as more of a facilitator and just a defensive energy guy, it's kind of like what they wanted to get from Patrick Beverly, but like an actual better version of it. So I think that would be pretty solid. Outside of just it being funny that he's going to go team up with LeBron, who he loves so much, I actually think the fit would be pretty good. So I think Warriors and Lakers are the only two realistic options for Draymond to succeed. He could go somewhere else, but I don't see why he would.
Yeah. Another player too that we can talk about, Kyle Kuzma, who just opted out of his contract. It seemed like the Wizards are just trying to get rid of everyone and rebuild with the young players that they have, especially the ones on the rookie contract. And we've seen, I mean, they can get free agents too, maybe not the type of top end free agents that we've seen throughout other teams. Like, I don't think they would be able to be in the running to get a guy like Giannis, but they can get those kind of second tier top guys that we've seen. So it seems like they're kind of going to rebuild with that. And a team that has been linked to Kyle Kuzma, which I wouldn't be surprised if he went back to, is the Lakers. The Lakers always talk about how they're going to get every single person in free agency, but if they're really going to get a guy, I think it's Kyle Kuzma. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes back there. It seems like after he left, there wasn't really kind of a falling out with the Lakers. So he's a guy that I wouldn't be surprised if he went back there. I mean, a few other teams too, pretty much anyone that'll give him money. I wouldn't be surprised if he just goes to a team, because there's a team out there that will pay Kyle Kuzma $20 million a year. I mean, we've seen it with Washington. They gave him a lot of money and they invested in taking him. But now their big three of Bradley Beal, Kyle Kuzma, and Porzingis will probably all be gone by next season. So I wouldn't be surprised. I think right now the leading favorite for Kyle Kuzma would probably be the Lakers. They'll have a little bit of money to play with after Austin Reeves gets signed.
Yeah, if you want, also if he wants to go back to LA, I think the Clippers are an option. He wouldn't be able to get that big money bag there, which maybe it's what he's looking for. But if he wants to compete, I think the Clippers have a lot of dudes that play like Kuzma, that Kuzma is a little bit better than. He could fill that Marcus Morris role. I know Marcus Morris wants to get out of there. He's pretty upset. Batum is probably on his last leg there. He plays a similar type of game to guys like that. So I think he'd fit in well, but he obviously wouldn't get the same amount of money where if he went to a team like Charlotte or, one of those teams that has a lot of money to throw around at a guy like Kuzma, So I guess it kind of just depends on what he wants. If he wants to kick it back to an LA team and compete, I respect that. But if he wants to make $20 million for one of the worst teams in the league, I really do understand that as well.
Yeah. Another guy, Fred VanVleet right now. It still seems like he could go back to the Raptors in some capacity, but if he was to leave, he opted out, but I wouldn't be surprised kind of if they do give him a new deal, especially with all the rumors of, especially if Pascal Siakam gets traded, which we've heard rumors of him getting traded on draft night for forever. And with everything that's going to go on in this draft with the second and third overall pick, if Brandon Miller gets drafted too, I think we're going to see a big trade at 3 just because there's so many teams that have mentioned trying to do that. So I do think, though, if he leaves, the Sixers are the number 1 option right now. But if James Harden goes back, I think that probably gets thrown out of the window. You're not going to be able to afford both of them. But the second favorite team besides the Sixers right now is the Suns. And I don't know if they trade DeAndre Ayton, I guess that makes sense to get the money. But this team is just I guess they're running Fred VanVleet, Bradley Beal, and Devin Booker and then Kevin Durant and whoever, Jock Landale at center with no bench. If they want to put all their money into there, I wouldn't be surprised if he went there. Kind of another dark horse team that I wouldn't be surprised is the Magic. They have money to give him, and I know they have a million guards on that team, and they just only draft guards, it seems like at this point. But I wouldn't be surprised if they try to get a veteran guy like that, or even a team like the Rockets too. I think there's a lot of options for Fred VanVleet. He's a very solid player where he is a role player, but as a point guard, he is probably one of the best guys on the market right now because you know exactly what you're going to get from him.
Yeah, and I really like Fred VanVleet for that exact reason. And I think you brought up a really good point. He might just end up going back to the Raptors. And it's not really his fault. It's just a lot of the teams that could compete and use a guy like him just don't have the money to afford him. So it's kind of going to be up to him if he wants to be, one of the better guys in Orlando or in Houston, or if he's comfortable sticking back with the Raptors. I think that directly depends on how the Raptors do in the draft. If they can get a point guard at 13 that they really like Hood-Schifino, or, one of those guys, Anthony Black, who I mentioned earlier, if one of those guys is around and they can pick him and they're confident in developing him, I think they might let VanVleet walk. But if they're more comfortable drafting another shooter, a 6'9" freak athlete type of dude also that they always like to draft, then VanVleet might just be the safe option to bring him back. So if I had to predict, with Harden seeming like he might go back to Philadelphia, I would think VanVleet might just stick with the Raptors.
Yeah. One more player that we can talk about too is Bruce Brown, who opted out of his contract. And I wouldn't be surprised if he goes back to the Nuggets, but Bruce Brown also seems like a guy, especially after this year, there's going to be a lot of teams that will pay him a lot of money. And I wouldn't be surprised if he goes to a team. It just depends on, we've seen this story play out a million times where a very good role player has a very good season, and then he leaves in free agency to go get a bag and then kind of just runs his career dry. We've saw it exactly with Kyle Kuzma, how that played out in Washington. And I still think Bruce Brown is a great player. I wouldn't be surprised if he goes back to the Nuggets, but a team that I wouldn't be surprised if he left the Nuggets would be the Magic, like I talked about with Fred VanVleet. I think they're trying to get another guy, and Bruce Brown, I think, would fit great on that team. He's a really good player overall, and they definitely want to help build that backcourt up. He's 6'4", he's small, but he's listed as a forward at this point, and he's played pretty well too, especially with how the NBA is right now, basically positionless at this point. We'll see after this draft too, with Victor and Chet Holmgren coming in next year, the NBA is just going to be like completely positionless at that point, because I wouldn't be surprised if either of those guys end up playing like small forward at some point, like we saw with Kevin Durant. So I think Bruce Brown, a great player overall. If he doesn't go back to the Nuggets, I think the Magic would definitely be a team to look out for.
Yeah, and I agree. But I think Bruce Brown will definitely stay with the Nuggets. That might sound like a hot take because they might not be able to give him the same amount of money as a team like the Magic. But Bruce Brown, he is like the ultimate team player, the ultimate role player, and he will never have a role like Denver again if he leaves. And that's not to say anything about him, but he was an essential piece to a championship team. He was the reason they won game 4. I mean, you can't say that about a lot of other role players in history. That's like some Robert Horry type of stuff. Like that's classic. And to my knowledge, he loves his time in Denver. I think it'll be worth it. And I know Denver has a lot of their guys tied up. They don't have a ton of money, but it's not like they're going to have to give Bruce Brown a minimum. Like they're going to give him some good cash too. So I think it's in his best interest to stay in Denver. But if he leaves, I hope he makes a ton of money. I mean, he really deserves it. I know we see teams overpay role players all the time. I know your favorite Tobias Harris would fit in that category, but Bruce Brown deserves it at the end of the day. So if he cares about the money, go make like $20 million. But I would love to see him stick it out in Denver and have them try to run it back from last year.
Yeah. One more point that we can talk about too. Obviously, the NBA draft coming up tonight as of this episode coming out. And as of right now, I mean, we've got a little bit of odds movement, and Brandon Miller is now minus 470 to land in Charlotte at number 2. And I mean, I still think Scoot is the second best player in this draft overall. And Charlotte will be pulling a Warriors that we saw. We talked about this a few weeks ago too, how if the Warriors took LaMelo Ball with that number 2 pick instead of going for the big man that they wanted, they would have been a lot better at this point. And now it seems like Charlotte is going to try to do that. They don't want to take the best player available at this point. I still think Brandon Miller is a great player, but I think Scoot is a lot better than him. I guess to put it nicely, I don't even know. I mean, Brandon Miller, I think is good, but there's a lot of things that we've seen from him, and especially a guy like him. We saw what happened in the NFL draft this year with Jalen Carter with his off the field stuff, and he went from the best player in the draft, arguably, to being drafted by the team that made the Super Bowl with a 9th overall pick. And especially if Scoot falls past the top 2, if he goes to 3, like I talked about earlier, there's so many teams that have been linked to trading up for them. I mean, the Raptors we've heard about Siakam getting traded. We've heard of everything going on with Dame 2 getting traded. There's so many teams that would want to get Scoot. So I wouldn't be surprised if he falls to 3. If there's not a trade, I would be very surprised, just because they can get a big package for that 3rd overall pick. And if you're getting a guy like Siakam, personally, I mean, I know Siakam may not be that superstar. I think he's kind of on the edge. He's a very good star player. But if you want to go with a more of a safe option with that, instead of drafting Scoot, and you kind of want to compete soon, I wouldn't be surprised if you trade away that 3rd overall pick. But you're going to get a lot back if you do.
Yeah, and I mean, these are why these lottery teams stay as lottery teams, because they would do stuff like that. I mean, I don't want to say I dislike Brandon Miller. And my prospect scouting, I got really into it this year. He was easily the 3rd best player in this draft, but in the same way, Scoot was easily the 2nd. There's really not a good competition between them. Brandon Miller does a lot of things well, and he would be a really good small forward on pretty much any NBA team. But you can't pass on a generational guy like Scoot and expect your team to improve in any way. It really, if I'm the Hornets and I'm thinking like, oh, I'm going to take Brandon Miller, you're better off trading the pick. And, I have a mock draft coming up. Hopefully that gets out. And, maybe a situation like that happens in the video is all I'm saying. But I really, I don't know what to tell you besides Scoot is just a better player than Brandon Miller. And Brandon Miller's legal problems is something that like doesn't come up in this draft, especially compared to what Jalen Carter's situation looked like. I almost said Jordan Davis, but Jalen Carter's situation was honestly less severe than this, and it caused him to plummet in the draft. And Brandon Miller's in the same situation, and we're talking about how he's a lock for number 2. It's just ridiculous. It really makes no sense to me, because what is he going to be, the star player in Charlotte? I just don't see it happening. And if he is, I think Charlotte's going to be a bottom feeder like every other year. I've talked about how I think the Hornets are like one of the worst teams in basketball, because you never think they're going to compete and they always disappoint. So it would just be another knock on their record. I wouldn't be surprised at all if they do it. But if Scoot falls to 3, I think it should be a race for every team in the league to try to trade up for 3, because he really is that dude. I know you're a fan of him personally, but like he's actually that guy. He's going to be one of the best point guards in the league coming soon. He had like one minor injury. He rolled his ankle and people started freaking out. They love to make excuses to put him farther down the board, because people love shakeup in the NBA draft. But he really is that guy. And I think Siakam would be an underpay for him. I know Siakam is awesome, but if I'm the Trailblazers and I have a chance to get a guy like Scoot, even with Dame still on the squad, and I trade that away for Pascal Siakam, it would just be a horrible decision. So I don't know. There's going to be a lot of fun things that happen in the NBA draft. Who knows how far Taylor Hendricks falls down the board? I know teams aren't a huge fan of him anymore. And then like Bilal Koulibaly out of France, he wasn't even on anybody's radar a month ago, and now people are saying he's going top 10. I'm so excited for the NBA draft. I hope you guys enjoy the prospect scouting video, but I don't know. I hate the Brandon Miller talk. It gets me frustrated. So I'll move past it, I guess.
Yeah, and with that third pick overall, especially too, if Portland wants to trade it with Dame there, I mean, they want to build a team that can compete now. And we've seen this happen before. The Lakers trading that fourth overall pick when they got Anthony Davis, which ended up being DeAndre Hunter. The Cavs trading that number one overall pick when LeBron went back to get Kevin Love. And even the Celtics trading the number fifth pick in 2007 when they got Ray Allen. And if they want to compete, if they really want that area right now, I mean, Dame is still playing amazing. So I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of get a package. Who knows what teams will give up, but there's a lot of teams that will give up a lot for this pick. And we've seen other teams too trade those top 10 picks, and they've got players that have helped their team overall. And I wouldn't be surprised, especially to see a team like Toronto go through and try to give them whatever they need to give them, whether it's Siakam and OG Anunoby, whatever you want to give up. I mean, we've seen so many other players linked to. If they stick and pick too, I mean, that wouldn't be bad, especially with Dame. If Dame leaves, that gives them an option to build around Scoot for the future. And if Dame stays, you kind of have that really good guard combination, and you don't need Scoot to be that number one guy right away, obviously, with Dame being so good, but that's a very good mentor for him at that point. So it'll be very interesting what we see going on in the draft. And by the time we come back next week, we'll have a lot of news. I mean, we could see a team trade away a star player, like we said, with Siakam getting that pick, or we could see, I mean, we never know what's really going to happen in any draft that we see. We talk about it for months and we build up these mock drafts, but until it comes down to it, you never really know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And it's going to be a fun one. I know we say that every year, but this draft, we have Victor, but after that, as we've seen with Brandon Miller and Scoot talks, all the way down the board, we don't have any idea. It reminds me a lot of the NFL draft from this year. You got a stud guy, but after that, who knows? So it'll be a good time. I'm sad the Celtics don't have a first rounder. The Sixers don't have one either, but who knows? Maybe they could trade up and get a guy too. It would help any team, really. It's such a deep class.
Yeah, and maybe we'll see the Sixers trade James Harden and get the number 3 overall pick, and they can draft Brandon Podziemski.
Yeah, number 3. Who knows?
And
who knows?
Shout out the Thompson twins. I'm very excited to see them get drafted. I've been a big fan of them since they went to OTE, and especially Amen. I think they're both going to be great in the league. And I mean, Amen, I think will go in with that 4th pick, but after that, Asur, he'll be in the top 10. But I think, especially with what we've seen going on, I think both of these players, it's cool to see twins getting drafted this high in any sport, and especially in the NBA. It's going to be cool to be able to see them maybe even play together. You never know.
Yeah, no, that would be really fun. I know they have their history of, beating up on 16-year-olds in the OTE, but the talent is undeniable and it's going to be fun. I mean, my guy Grady Dick, I really think he should be a top 10 pick. It's not even just for like the jokes and the name. He really is that guy. He's going to be an ultimate floor spacer. So going into the draft with a couple guys that you're a fan of always makes it more fun. So yeah, it'll be a good time, man.
Yep. And we'll see you guys next week after the draft is over.
See you guys.